Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Everyman's Odyssey podcast, where we explore the challenges and values of authentic living through sharing stories and ideas. I'm your host, Cole McClure. So, last podcast episode, we started talking about basically my life story, and turns out as you get older, your stories get longer. So, I had to cut it off basically right as I'm getting the approval to go pursue flight school. So we're just going to pick up from there, and just like last time, I've got some notes here just because I feel like it's so easy to leave some things out, and I'm still even now going to gloss over maybe even some big sections of my life as far as time, but trying to keep this manageable and try and keep this to just two parts. So I've got some notes here to make sure I touch on some areas. So we'll just start off with that. So I finally got the approval that I needed from that FAA doctor in DC to at least get that very first issuance of my medical certificate for flight school. I believe that was fall 2011. However, at the time, there was only one flight school in California that was approved for GI Bill funding. And that one had a wait list. So I just kind of enrolled in the school and waited for my phone call. And then in January of 2012, I got a call from the school saying that I had a slot available, but I had less than 2 weeks to get there. So packed up all my stuff, gave notice for the apartment that we were living in at the time with me, Nicole, and our only child at that point, Addison. And I got help from my father-in-law to move down before Nicole came down. And so we drove down, my father-in-law and I, to Tulare, California, and got an apartment that we had found online right before, got down there in the middle of the night, and slept in the apartment that night thinking, okay, well, this isn't so bad. And woke up the next morning and immediately knew that it was not a place I wanted to spend a long time. No offense to anybody from Tulare, but it was not a great neighborhood that we were living in, and not a scenic place, I'll say. But nonetheless, I was there for flight school and got started. And the school was fine. I'm not going to name the school because it certainly had some issues with the structure of the program and the way that it was managed. But at the time, I appreciated the way that they approached the discipline and the structure of their flight school. They made it sound similar to a military environment, and in my head, that still sounded like a good thing. So they were very strict on the scheduling of your flights, making sure you don't miss anything, being there for the classes, being there early. And so that gave me confidence in, the competency of the pilots, the safety and the quality of the maintenance being done on the helicopters. It all seemed like a pretty good thing. So I started flying. And that first portion, we're going through the ground schooling, a lot of time just sitting in the hangar, getting ground instruction before we start actually flying. And my first couple flights were absolutely terrifying. Loved it, but it was just such a weird feeling. And I will say it took me a while to get the hang of hovering. Robinson R-22s are very small helicopters with not a whole lot of power, and they're very sensitive on the controls. I had a great time, but I struggled to learn to hover. But just like, when I was getting my driver's license when I was younger, I was so terrible at backing up that I spent the vast majority of my driver's training in reverse. and now I'm great at it. So it's kind of the same thing. I spent so much time having to get training and focusing on hovering, that by the end of that, they start teaching you how to either knock over or stack traffic cones, just by using your skids and staying in one place. And so that fine tuning, that work felt really good to be good at something. And to see that progression, it's very, very obvious noticing your progression when it comes to your skill as a pilot, because either you can hold the helicopter still or you can't. So it's pretty easy to gauge how you're doing. But I had a great time with it. And so as the months went on, the weather warms up, flights get a lot shorter or more difficult because you just don't have as much power, and the high temperatures there. I remember one day it got so hot we were technically still okay to take off, but we go to take off in this little helicopter and it just won't come off the ground because the skids had basically melted into the asphalt. The asphalt was so hot it got soft and just kind of warped around the skid of the helicopter, and we got stuck there. So we had to break apart part of the runway to put the thing back in the hangar. And around that time, my great-grandmother had passed away, and that's where that military structure came back to bite me. I told him, my grandma had passed. I needed to take some time off so I could get all the way up to Oregon and go to the funeral, be with some family. And at that point, we're flying at least every day, sometimes twice a day. And the rule was, if you miss 2 flights, you're kicked out. And there was no wiggle room, no grace for that. And so I missed my grandmother's funeral because I didn't want to get kicked out of flight school. That was kind of my only shot. And so I suppose that was still the right call at the time. But I definitely resented that structure and the approach that they took to their students at that point. And as time went on, I got my private pilot's license, which was fantastic. Still, had some struggles along the way, but actually, in fact, one of my very first solo flight, I remember being so nervous. I flew over the apartment complex to see if I could, catch Nicole, and then flew back to the airport. And I was just so nervous that I hadn't really paid attention enough to know that, the winds had changed. So everybody's approach is changing. And I'm the only one who's not with the program, not seeing that everybody else is changing the angle that they're coming at the runway. We were coming this way. Now everybody's turned around because of the wind. And I just wasn't catching on because I was just so overwhelmed that I got to the point where I'm trying to land and the helicopter's not cooperating. And there's this feeling that you get, in the Robinson 22 that you start to become light in your seat. And it's a very dangerous sign that your aircraft is not in a safe condition and you could be crashing pretty shortly if you don't fix things. And finally, it just kind of snapped. Okay, well, why isn't this working? And then my instructor's on the ground coming over the radio. Makes it very clear how stupid of a mistake I was making. So I, left that final approach, re-entered the pattern, fixed, and came back. So hopefully I'm not the only one who has those kind of dumb mistakes in their past, going through flight school. But that was a big one. And so after I had learned from that, gone on and got my private license, some of the other students there were also pretty unhappy with the program and had told me about another flight school up in Oregon. And so I had talked to some of the instructors there and had to have a meeting with them. It was nothing personal about the instructors themselves, but I was deciding to move on and pursue a program somewhere else. And during this time, Nicole is actually working full time for Mac at a mall nearby. So I'm in school full time, flying every single day. There's a crazy amount of studying and homework that comes with with flight school. Nicole is working full time, and yet we still have a very young child in the home, and balancing that and trying to find dependable childcare, it was a very difficult time. And any hiccup with VA funding, which happened a lot, sent us into this spiral to where we even had a pay or quit notice. Our utilities got shut off because I didn't get paid by the VA for my GI Bill for months. And now the school is willing to work with you because they know the funding's there. They know they're going to get it. But, your landlord doesn't know. The utility company doesn't know. And so things just started falling apart. And so that was a very stressful time that I'm certainly grateful for now, because I understand peace and provision in times of uncertainty. And that all worked out, and we ended up leaving that program. And so, unfortunately, we didn't really have the money for all of us to rent a place in Bend, Oregon. So Nicole went back to Redding and stayed with her family, and I rented a room from someone. Started out in Redmond, and then soon found a room that I was renting in Bend. And so I got to Bend in, I want to say, September of 2012. And I spent a lot of time alone. Didn't have friends or connections there. And, at the school in California, there was really no actual college course time, even though that was part of the VA program. You're supposed to be earning a degree. The way that they structured the program, that just wasn't happening there. But now that I'm in Bend, I do have a full-time course load of actual college classes on top of all my ground instruction, on top of the flight training. And so going through my instrument rating at that time is even more intense than the private pilot's license, because it's so technical and methodical, and the rules and learning about the weather. It was a very intense training program. And as it should be. I mean, it's a pretty big deal. You need to be able to be safe in those environments. But obviously that didn't leave a lot of free time. And now with Nicole and Addison still being in California, every chance I got, on the weekends, I'm driving from Bend to Redding, Friday afternoon, and then leaving Sunday morning. And so we're constantly struggling with that. And we, at this point, we got married in 2007. Now it's late 2012, going into 2013, this whole time being separated, not getting to establish a normal relationship. And that caused a lot of struggles. Even with that, I was still struggling with being a civilian. I still didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. I obviously, didn't belong in the Army. I was medically retired from it. There was no way that they wanted me back, and hadn't made good connections with my family again. Hadn't really connected with my friends. So I just felt lost this whole time. So then during that, to not be with my wife, it was really hard. And so I did start seeing a VA therapist at some point during that time, and that was going okay. But then in early 2014, I actually got a job it was a paid internship through Wounded Warrior, to where I would be working as a veterans representative for a congressional office, which was an absolutely fantastic job. And it afforded us the opportunity to actually live together again, because now, I had the income from my GI Bill paying a monthly stipend for being enrolled in school full time, as well as the paid internship. That was enough, just barely, but it was enough to get a house to where Nicole and Addison could come up with me. And that made such a huge difference, which was great for me. But of course, again, Nicole is moving away from her family and uprooting things to go to a new environment, a new place where we don't know anybody. And while I am in school full time and working full time, she's at home with our little girl, but has nobody else around her. And on top of me being so busy with work and school, I'm also still struggling with my own mental health issues. So I'm not a present partner like I should be, even in those moments. And so that characterized a lot of that year in 2014. And in fact, this is certainly not something that I'm proud of, not something I would recommend, but for the sake of honesty, during that time, I didn't know how to tell my wife that I so strongly wanted to be back in the Army. Like that, as a husband and a father, it sounded terrible to even say out loud that I missed the Army now that I finally have my wife and daughter living with me. But I was just still so lost, but I didn't want to tell her that because I already felt guilt just from feeling that way, and I didn't want her to know that, as if she couldn't already sense it. But I didn't know how to deal with it. So I started going to mental health appointments for the VA after work, but not wanting Nicole to know how much I was struggling. I just lied for months. I said I was working late, stuck at the office, or, taking a long time to get back from meetings for veterans events, when in reality I was going to see a therapist about wanting to be in the military. And not because I wanted to get away from my family. I was ecstatic to be with them again. But I just couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong. And so I really, tanked our relationship during that time, just from those seeds of dishonesty and doubt. And it finally came out in an argument that I actually told her the truth about what was going on. And it was I don't remember exactly how it went, but I know I didn't handle it well. And so early 2015 was a very, very hard time for our marriage, to the point that it almost ended. And it reached to the point where, Nicole just flat out said, hey, I'm done. I want to be near my family again. I want to feel normal and have community. And like I said, I didn't handle this gracefully. I'm not going to pretend that I handled it well and we made this smooth transition because I showed any ounce of wisdom. It's not how that went. But we did end up moving back to California. Obviously she had followed me around the country, around the world, had always been there to support everything that I wanted to do in this pursuit of getting my helicopter pilot's license. And of course, during this time in 2014, I did finish my instrument rating and my commercial rating, which was great fun. I had a great time. Never ended up being a profession, but I did get paid to fly helicopters, and it was incredible. But the time came to actually listen to my wife's needs, which I had been terrible about. So we moved back to California and had no job, hadn't finished my instructor rating for the helicopters. I just had my commercial and instrument. which means that, I didn't finish my degree. And we didn't have a place to come back to, so we're couch surfing at that point, the three of us, living in my brother and sister-in-law, Cassie and Sam, living in their living room, out of a suitcase with a bed pushed in the corner of the living room, which I'm eternally grateful for, and how gracious and loving they were to let us do that, all the while knowing the turmoil that we're going through in our relationship, and they were just there to love on us. And that was incredible and instrumental in the recovery of our relationship. But eventually I did find a job working for a county veteran service office, which is obviously very related to the work that I was doing in the congressional office in Bend. And so I loved the work. I love helping veterans, with the military experience that I had and the gap there in not fulfilling my commitment. I'm very passionate about helping my brothers and sisters as they come out and making sure that their transition, was easier than mine and that they get the benefits that they deserve. So I was very grateful to get that job, and I loved it, despite whatever coworker conflicts there may have been during that time. I loved the job and I was good at it. And then, and Nicole was working during this time as well. And then we found out that she was pregnant with Emma. And that was such an incredible experience. We were so overjoyed. But immediately there comes the realization, Nicole would like to stop working at Mac during this time and raise our kids, which for me meant that I had to double my income basically by the time the baby was born. Obviously that wasn't going to happen in the same job, in the same position. And so I had tried other routes of promotions and staying within that department, but I was kind of locked into $11 an hour at that point, which just wasn't going to cut it. And so I met with my boss and I told him I absolutely love this job and I don't want to go, but this is where my life is at and I have to start looking for other work. And so I was very clear with my boss, and he was a great boss and I loved working for him, but I needed something to take care of my family. That was my number one priority. And so through some connections with my dad, he knew some people in PG&E, and so I ended up getting in touch with a contractor recruiter. So it wasn't directly employed by PG&E. It was employed by this third party as an independent contractor for PG&E. But I got a job that was, more than double of what I was making, which is exactly what I needed. The only catch was the job was in Concord, and it was not a telecommute sort of thing. So the timing worked out. It was actually such a blessing that Emma was born 5 weeks premature, perfectly healthy. She didn't have to stay in the hospital a whole lot, but she was very early, which gave me 2 weeks with her after she was born. I had 2 weeks where we were all together before I had to leave again and rent a room so I could go work in Concord while they were living in Redding. And so, again, our family isn't whole. We're not together. We're not building that bond and that family dynamic during such a pivotal time with the baby being born. And Nicole is incredibly strong and patient and devoted, and she held it down. And it was the same thing. Like, I would work during the week and I would come home for a day on the weekend and then have to be back by Sunday night to go to work again down in Concord. And so we did that for about 6 months, just me coming back on the weekend, her being in Redding with, our 2 kids now, including a brand new baby, holding it down on her own, with some support, obviously, from her family. But in our minds, that was just the sacrifice that we were making for long-term goals. I had really not even been thinking about potential jobs as a pilot at that point. I was just trying to take care of my family. And so my supervisor at the time, he told me that at the end of my 6-month contract, he had every intention of hiring me on permanently directly through PG&E. He said I was a great worker, we did a good job, and that was his intention. And so at the end of that 6 months, which would have been the end of November of 2016, there was a court decision that came out, which resulted in a judgment against PG&E, huge fines that had to be paid, which meant that PG&E had to make some cuts. And so the day that I was supposed to be hired on directly through PG&E, I was one of the first people to get let go. And so he apologized, took me out to lunch, and that was it. I was unemployed again. Now, that's obviously devastating. And again, just feel like the rug's pulled out from under us. And okay, well, what are we going to do? How am I going to provide for my growing family? But even prior to that, I'd kind of already made a decision that I wanted to pivot and try and pursue something in law enforcement. So when I first got out of the Army, I told Nicole, in 2010, I'm 22 years old, having just gone through what we had gone through. I told her I wanted to be a cop. And she very wisely said, hell no. And that's, I can't remember the exact, discussion, the wording at the time, but I do know that she was right. I was in no place to pursue a career in law enforcement. It wouldn't have worked. And if it had, it wouldn't have gone well. And so we had gone through the other things that we had gone through. But then some things happened during the summer of 2016. And I remember just calling Nicole, crying and telling her, I can't not try anymore. I'm watching people who have taken the same oath take these risks and die, while I sat at a computer as an analyst for gas leaks. And I'm not talking down on that job at all. I am very grateful for the jobs that really everybody has that betters our communities. But for me personally, as someone who felt so strongly the need to protect others and to make sacrifices for the betterment of other people, it was painful to watch some of the things that had been going on at that time. So I told Nicole, I got to try. We got to figure something out. And maybe it won't work out. Maybe I'll never be a cop. But it can't be because I didn't try. And so I got laid off, came back home to Redding, and tried to figure it out from there. Cassie, my sister-in-law, was working for Blue Shield of California at the time, and so she helped me get an interview, and I ended up getting a job there just in customer support on the phones, all the while looking for other job opportunities in law enforcement. And so I'd had a couple interviews with local law enforcement agencies that just hadn't gone well, honestly, mostly because of me, not getting the questions right or not dressing right for the interviews. The timing just wasn't right, I suppose. All the while, at least now I've got a stable job. I was working for Blue Shield there in Redding, and the job wasn't great, being a phone representative for an insurance company. There's not a lot of people who are happy to talk to you. And I did my very best to try and make people happy, did everything I could to right the situation for them, all the while trying to have fun. It's a tough job, and you don't get a lot of downtime. You have a lot of calls that are waiting, and you have to get to those calls. But Blue Shield did do a good job of taking care of their people and making them feel appreciated. In fact, it's something that I still do. They just would constantly, your leadership and your peers, you're like, hey, I appreciate you. And that's had an impact on how I interact with people, especially with coworkers. It's not just, oh yeah, thanks, I appreciate it. But like, I appreciate you and what you're doing. And I feel like Blue Shield did a great job at that, and had excellent frontline supervisors. The leadership that I had directly over me, incredible individuals, very humble and selfless and optimistic, positive, did a great job of leading their teams through difficult times, and had a lot of fun too. I really embraced and enjoyed pranks. And sometimes that meant I had to stay a little bit later, or maybe spent a little bit of money when I shouldn't have. But, a friend at work, Dalton, and we'd split the cost on, I think it was 950 bounce house balls, the ball pits that you jump in. Oh, we got some on Amazon and built a little wall for our supervisor's cubicle and filled it with 950 of those balls. And that was hilarious and absolutely worth it. And then filling other supervisors' office with hundreds and hundreds of balloons, some of them filled with glitter. So when you go to pop the balloons to get them out of your office, you get glitter bombed, or very festive Christmas decorations that would drive someone crazy. I did everything I could to have a good time at that job, and I absolutely enjoyed it. There were some other issues there that, just like any job, nothing's perfect. But I was there for just shy of 2 years, and eventually, had been applying for basically every position that came up with a local law enforcement agency, to the point that one of their officers finally just called me and said, hey, like, what are you trying to do? It's like, oh, well, I want to be a police officer, so I'm just applying for every single job that opens up in your department until I get something as my foot in the door. And he said, well, please stop doing that. That's not that's not how you get to where you want to go. If you want to be a police officer, don't come to your interview for this position. Just wait. We've got a position opening up that I think would be a better transition, gives you more responsibility. That's going to be your foot in the door. So I pulled back, I waited, and eventually got this job as a community work program officer for this police department. And I was really excited to have my foot in the door. And the vision that officer had for what that program was going to be was right in line with something I wanted to do, and would have given me an opportunity to prove myself to go into hopefully a sponsored position to go through academy. Leadership quickly changed, and the vision for that role changed with it. There wasn't a whole lot of higher level responsibility. It was, or any sort of direction on my part. It was just, here's some inmates, pick them up, watch them pick up trash, and call it a day. Now during that time, we had, wildfires and COVID during that time. So for the vast majority of the time, we actually didn't have a lot of inmate worker crews because of the rules around that. So just me and my coworker cleaning up garbage all over town. And again, had fun doing it. We worked really hard. But it was a good department and I had a good time. It did, however, become very clear and was explicitly stated that I would not be getting a recruit position. And there's some weird misunderstandings that led to that, but it was very apparent if I was going to be a police officer, it wasn't going to be on their dime. I was going to have to put myself through academy. And I didn't want to be a community work program officer for my whole life. So I started getting prepared to go to police academy and just pay my way through. And so I got enrolled. And so November of 2020, I was supposed to start academy. But then, was it September 16th or the end of September that year, I got hurt at work. It was just the dumbest thing. And just getting out of my truck, going to check on a site and get out of the work truck, and the street that I was parked at the edge to go into the work site, it broke underneath my boot, and completely inverted my boot. I caught myself on the door, but it was too late. I looked down and my foot is completely inverted. I'm looking at the bottom of my boot and felt the pop go all the way up my leg, and I knew something was pretty messed up. But I had a car parked behind me. I'm hauling a trailer. The gate was still locked in front of me, so I called an officer out. They opened the gate for me, and it was all I could do to use that foot to push on the gas pedal and just try and coast back to the police department and hobble into a van and get to urgent care and get checked out. And their initial response was, they did an x-ray, looks like nothing's broken, go ahead and start physical therapy. And so I started physical therapy, and it was excruciating. Just 3 weeks of somebody just pulling and pounding and stretching on my ankle, to the point that I finally told them I can't do this anymore. Like, it's getting worse every single day. I need something else. So they did an MRI and immediately told me, do not go back to physical therapy. Everything is torn. No bones broken technically. All the ligaments, tendons split completely in half, to the point that my bones had started to warp out of place. And so stopped doing that and just kind of waited until I got approved for my first surgery. And so December 18th of 2020, a week before Christmas, I get this surgery. And so they took a bunch of screws and plastic, wrapped it around my foot, drilled holes into my bones, put the screws and anchored all this plastic into place to try and hold everything together again. And God, that was painful. Obviously, the surgery itself wasn't, I was unconscious, but I remember waking up confused because you're coming out of the anesthesia, but in so much pain. And I'm pretty sure I threw up sitting in the wheelchair. And I remember one of the staff members sticking some sort of pill, I think it was a painkiller, shoving it down my throat as I'm gagging. And while I'm still crying from the pain, honestly, and he shoves that pill down my throat, they wheel me out the door. And I get back home from surgery, and I'm pretty sure my brother-in-law, Sam, carried me into the house. And so that week before Christmas, I didn't sleep. It was by far the worst pain I've ever experienced. I've had kidney stones a couple times. I've got Crohn's disease. Like, pain is not a stranger. But this was like nothing I had ever felt before, just nonstop pain. And they had, given me very, very strong narcotic painkillers, which I had already explained, like, hey, I don't think those work for me. Like, I don't want to take them. It's not going to do anything. Is there anything else? No. And so I tried taking the painkillers a couple times, and all it did was make me throw up, but didn't do anything for the pain. And so I think it was Christmas Day. Maybe it's Christmas Eve. That's kind of a blurry time for me. We had family come over. At that point, I still hadn't been able to sit up. I mean, I could not let my leg hang down to the point where blood would start circulating to it because it was so painful. But for Christmas, I hobbled my butt out onto the couch and sat there with family for a couple hours with just trying to hold back the tears until the point I just went back to bed. And that recovery took months before I could even start doing physical therapy. And again, Nicole just steps up to the plate like she's never had to before, because now, this is worse than me being gone for work, and she's there with the kids. Now she's got me to take care of as well. And during this time, of course, so my injury was in September of 2020. Our youngest daughter was born in March that year. Fortunately, just before a lot of the lockdowns started to happen because of COVID. So we still got to have, a somewhat normal experience for that, for her being born. But now the baby's 6 months old, and now I not only am not there to help, I am a draw. It takes so much, and the things that Nicole did to take care of me during that time is just blows me away, and I'm so grateful for who she is and how loving she is. And because after months, it's not even just the physical pain anymore. I was very active in my job. I was pursuing a career that I was passionate about, that I had been trying for years to get into, and all of that is just gone in a moment. And so some very real depression and anxiety and this overwhelming sense of worthlessness just takes over. I can't provide for my family. Like, I'm on workers' comp, so we're getting something, but it's not enough. I'm not active. I'm not helping anybody. I'm not working. I'm not taking care of my family. I'm watching my wife run herself ragged to take care of our 3 children on her own and still be patient and gracious and kind as a caregiver to me. And so obviously physically I'm already busted apart, but emotionally I really sunk in to a pretty sad state. And so as the recovery goes on, I do a few months of physical therapy, and my physical therapist, had been alluding to the idea that I should pursue a different career. In fact, he had another business that he did on the side that he would like me to, I should go work for him. Forget about being a police officer and the recovery and going back to this department, just come work for me. And so, I went to a couple of appointments. I heard his pitch and I need to get back to work. And so the day before I was supposed to go back to work, we're doing this final exam. I'm walking again, not quite running, but I'm walking. And so we test out my stability, walking over uneven terrain and doing normal tasks of just lifting things and walking around and this sort of thing. And then the very last part of that examination, he grabs my foot and starts to feel the tendons, and you can still feel the screws in my ankle. And he grabs my ankle and he pulls on it. And again, just felt this pop shoot up my leg. And I tell him to stop, and I just knew, that did it. I felt the same feeling again, started swelling up. I get another MRI. Sure enough, all the tendons and ligaments that had healed had split apart again. And that plastic that they put in my foot wasn't enough to hold it together. So now I have to wait, I think it was, another 3 to 5 months, I can't even remember at this point, to get another surgery to do this procedure all over again. And boy, was I mad. I mean, at this point, you've just got to be kidding me. I can't catch a break. Fortunately, it went through a different hospital. And so I'm getting ready for my next, and I know I'm skipping ahead. I'm getting ready for the next surgery, and the anesthesiologist comes in. He asks me about my concerns. I told him I am terrified of the amount of pain that I experienced after the last one. And thank God for this guy. He says, well, what do you mean? You shouldn't be feeling any pain. I was like, dude, it's pretty painful. And he said, well, what about the nerve block? And I said, well, what's a nerve block? And so he's like, what we do is we block the nerve so you won't feel anything for at least 2 days. And he was right. I mean, that was incredible. They did a nerve block, redid the surgery again, doubled up on all the screws and the amount of plastic that's in my foot, cinched everything down super tight, and way less pain than before. Obviously, it doesn't feel good. But during that time, I'm recovering and still terrified that, not only am I not going to be a police officer because I can't run, I can't hike, I can't chase somebody, I can't, get over a fence. I'm not sure how I'm going to do in a fight. And I just felt, okay, well, this dream's over. All the while, there's miscommunications with my medical team and the workers' comp team. And so now my employer thinks that I'm lying about my injuries, which makes no sense. I don't know why I would go so far as to get a second surgery to cover my tracks, but there was just a simple miscommunication that never got cleared up. And so it got to the point that they actually hired a private investigator to follow me around and videotape me before they finally realized that I can't run, I can't do normal things. It was for real. And eventually that got to the point where they just wanted to cut ties, didn't want to move forward with the actual hearing and disability rating, because during that time I'd started getting harassing phone calls, and it's just people doing their job, making sure that, they work for the city, they represent the city, and they want to make sure that I'm not lying or being fraudulent or taking advantage of them. But I started getting some harassing phone calls trying to pin it on that somehow it had been a previous injury and wasn't something that had happened during work, which just wasn't the case. I'd never injured my ankle before. So I ended up getting a lawyer. And so we went through that whole process, and it felt terrible because I loved the department, even though I felt like I had been kind of mistreated quite a bit. But I was still passionate about the work and wanted to get back to it. So the change in that relationship, once you have a lawyer and you're going through a workers' comp case, it feels like it's hard to come back. And it was hard to go back because part of their decision was asking me to resign so they could fill my position, which to me felt understandable based on how long my recovery had been. They needed somebody in that position. But part of that resignation was agreeing to never take or apply for any job for that city ever again, which seemed a little extreme. But at that point, I felt like, what does it matter? Sure, I will never apply to work for this city again. Here you go. And then that was it. They closed out the case. I got a lump sum payout that we were able to pay off our car and just try and eke out a living, seeing how long we're going to make this last. And during that time, I had started a business with my dad. Obviously, I couldn't operate it. We were operating heavy equipment. We had a skid steer doing fuel mitigation and brush clearing. I couldn't even get into the piece of machinery to actually do any sort of work. But we did have, a long-term goal. If I'm not going to be a police officer, this is something that maybe I can do someday once I'm fully recovered. And so we start working on that, but I'm not taking any other jobs because I want to pursue this with him, even though I can't actually work yet. And so we're just living off of as little as possible, trying to make that workers' comp claim last. And I had a great time working with my dad. That was something that you don't get a lot of opportunities to do. My dad worked a lot and had just retired from PG&E. And I feel like, growing up, he was absolutely a good dad. He was gone all the time. But when he was around, we made memories, and I have no issues with that. But this was an opportunity to get some of that time and build a relationship that, we didn't have during a lot of, my teenage years, then early adulthood, being in the military and then moving around so much. I was very excited about the opportunity to build that relationship. And so for a while, the work was really steady, and, he was doing all of it at first because I couldn't do anything. I was just kind of this silent partner, not contributing anything, which again, felt terrible. But we get to the point where I'm recovered enough to get into the equipment, and we had a great time. I loved every bit of it. It was good work. It was hard work. I was outside getting dirty, and it's a kind of job where you see your progression the entire time you're working. But unfortunately, the work was not as plentiful as we had hoped. And it just was not providing. For me, that being my only income, it wasn't enough to take care of the family. However, I wanted to be invested and I wanted to see it through. So I'm not even looking for other work in the meantime because I don't want to compromise my schedule for this business. And so that goes on for quite a while, to the point that, we can't pay our bills, phones getting shut off, internet's getting shut off. We're, having to borrow money, just in a very vulnerable financial situation that brought on a lot of fear and a lot of shame. And we just lived in that for a long time. And that's on me. I spent way too much time not willing to do what's necessary to take care of our family. And, as usual, Nicole was very patient and kind and an excellent communicator during this time. Not to say that our relationship didn't have any struggles during this time, because it's such a constant high stress environment to not know how you're going to feed your kids. It's a very real fear and stress to have conversations, with your spouse every night on the couch, both of us sometimes just in tears. I have absolutely no idea. Like, we can't just keep borrowing money, but we also have to feed our kids. And so, I had done things like DoorDash, and we started delivering groceries, anything we can, sometimes spending 12 hours a day out in the car trying to deliver groceries just to make enough to buy our own groceries. And so eventually those opportunities for work with the business with my dad had slowed down so much and for so long that I just had to get something else. And before I get into that and how we moved forward from there, stepping back a little bit during this time, through COVID and the results of that, and things not related to COVID at all, but I had lost all of my grandparents. My great-grandpa in Oregon, he had passed away, and he was a great man. Served in World War II in a anti-air artillery battery, was a security guard for the Nuremberg trials, and just a strong, tough man. And so me, being in the Army as well and being stationed in Germany and talking to him about, what Nuremberg looked like when I was there versus when he was there. And, he always liked to joke because after he was done in Germany, he was on a plane to go to Japan, and plane turned around and said, nope, we're done. Like, the war's over. We won. And he would like to tell us that, they must have heard he was coming because he was a tough guy. And so they just surrendered. But so we had lost him, and my dad's mom, she got Alzheimer's, and that was a long, difficult struggle. Hard to watch, her go through that and what that looks like for the family. Not to mention, what my dad and his sister and their families are going through. It was a really hard thing. And during that time, my grandpa, my dad's dad, had his own struggles. After retirement, you could tell that his PTSD had been steadily getting worse. He was infantry in Vietnam, 2 Purple Hearts. And I know, from some of the stories that he had told me, he struggled a lot with survivor's guilt. His best friend during that time was killed in a firefight, standing right next to him. And both 21-year-old kids. And I remember him telling me that, his best friend had a wife and a baby at home. And at that time, he had nobody back home, and just this constant, overwhelming guilt that his friend died and not him. And he made it through, multiple helicopter crashes and grenades going off and bombs getting dropped in the wrong place, and made it through all that. And then just had this overwhelming guilt for the fact that he survived. And so as his PTSD progressed, being married to it and living with someone who is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the two just aggravated each other's conditions to the point that they ended up in separate living facilities. And so my grandmother ended up passing away while I was still working for that police department, but at least I was able to leave and go be by her side and pray with her, as she was passing. And then as my grandfather's condition worsened, he would be in and out of hospice, and I had tried to connect with him, but he just didn't want to get better. I had worked with him on getting some of his VA benefits to come through, and I wanted so bad to help him, because in my background, obviously being in the Army, but not just that, like having spent so much time working with veterans and helping them. I had worked with guys who were Vietnam vets, had PTSD so bad that they literally didn't talk for 2 years, and then ended up being in these support groups, being leaders and helping other people. So I just had this sense of duty and optimism that I should be able to help him. And it just got to the point that he wouldn't talk. He'd just glare at me, or if he did talk, he'd be telling me to leave. And I know why, but eventually it got to the point that he's dying, just allowing his body to go because he didn't want to recover. His wife is gone. He's been struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt his entire, adult life, basically, despite being, a fantastic grandpa, lots of great memories with him. He's a good man, but always had that struggle. And so I'm on crutches at this point, and I go to his bedside, and everybody else was kind of done talking. We were kind of wrapping up, and I said, I just need some time to talk to him. And obviously he's not responsive, not awake from what I can tell, but just hoping that he hears me. And I'm not going to go into the exact words that I shared with him. But I just reminded him that it wasn't his fault. That he was a good man, and that I was so grateful that he survived and came home and had the life that he did, and that it wasn't his fault and he shouldn't punish himself, and he is loved. And so I prayed with him, kissed him on the head, and I said, don't hang on to punish yourself. You deserve peace. And I didn't know how to handle that from there. So I just grabbed my crutches and I walked out and got in the car. Nicole backed out of the driveway, and immediately I get a call from my dad saying that he had passed. And I loved him very much, and he was a good man. And I hope that, something that I said to him in those moments helped. And so I will always wish that I had done more and wish that I could have helped him. But in the end, I'm grateful that I was able to be there and share the words and the perspective that I had with him. And what feels like not at all long after that, my mother's parents both got very sick and ended up in the hospital. And at this point, visitation is so limited because of the COVID restrictions that are still in place, until it got to the point that my mom's mom is dying. So they're allowing us to come in to say goodbye. And so we went into the room, said our goodbyes, and they still weren't allowing for my grandma and my grandpa to be in the same room, despite my grandpa aggressively making attempts to be by his wife's side. He was made to stay in his own separate room. So after that, we go to see him in his room, and he's actually doing quite a bit better. He's sharing some stories. He was also in the Army, and was a pilot and loved talking about aviation, and so we did that for a little bit, and then he's talking about like he'd probably be out of here in a couple days. He's feeling pretty good, and so we talked for a little while and then leave, and then that night my grandma passed away, and he had already decided and had even mentioned he's not going to go home without his wife. And so instead of making the recovery that he had talked about, he passed soon, very shortly after that. And so within a couple years, all those familial connections were gone. And so I'm sorry to jump around and go back in time and hit some of that heavy stuff, but I didn't want to not talk about that. So I guess going back forward again, looking for work, I make the decision and agree to what Nicole has been trying to communicate to me this whole time is I need to find work, and at that point I felt so unqualified for everything because of physical limitations or just some experiences with employers in the past. Just feel like what am I going to be able to get? So I go into a temp agency, explain my experience, and at that point I feel like I've got a pretty good resume. I've gone through flight school, I was in the military, worked in congressional offices, county offices, worked for local police department, but I'll take whatever I can get. And so they fill out some applications. A temp job comes up for a local law enforcement agency. And so I work for them as a temp. And during that interview process, they asked me, well, have you ever thought about a career in law enforcement? I was like, actually, that's been the goal, since 2016. And now it's 2022. And so while working that temp job, I'm also going through the application and the background process to get a job as a sworn officer in this agency. And it certainly seemed like, a perfect fit. I got along great with the staff there. I liked the people. That particular line of work I wasn't particularly interested in, but had a lot of respect for the people who were doing it. And so I was looking forward to, again, getting my foot in the door. And they ended up acquiring for their agency a helicopter. Well, shoot, this is perfect. Maybe it's coming full circle. And so I was really looking forward to, finishing this background process and, do this work that is my primary function. But now I have the opportunity to perhaps get back into aviation. And so I was very excited about that prospect. And so we get through the backgrounds process, and I'm getting ready. What I'm thinking is to start work. And so I ask the supervisor, like, hey, when's this going to happen? Oh, well, we don't know yet. And they said, okay, well, you're working this temp job Friday. We'll see you Monday, for the real job. And so that happens for a couple weeks. And hey, what is going on? And they finally told me, like, hey, we just found out, it's nothing you did. You didn't fail your psych eval. You passed the background check, but it's out of our hands. Like, there's been a decision made. We're not going to hire you, but we can't tell you why, which is normal. That happens in background investigations. But I was devastated. Part of me is relieved because the primary function of the job wasn't something that I wanted, but I wanted to work again, and at least I'd be in the industry. But that just wasn't going to happen. And I believe it was that same day that I get the news, like, that I'm not going to get this job. My best friend, who works for a different local law enforcement agency, calls me up. And so I give him the news, like, hey, I'm not getting this job. I don't know what I'm doing. I can't stay at the temp job forever, but it seems like nothing I do is working out. I said, oh, well, our agency is hiring. We just got this new position that opened up, and you'd be kind of perfect for it. You should definitely apply. And so I applied. I feel like I'm pretty well suited for the position. Interview process went pretty smooth. Backgrounds went smooth. And so as of now, I've been with this agency for coming up on 6 months now. And what a blessing. I mean, I could not be happier with my job function, the people that I'm serving and helping, the impact that I have on my community, the administration that I work with, my coworkers. The agency that I work for is phenomenal, and I am so grateful for every single job that hasn't worked out or hasn't lasted, because I wholeheartedly believe that I am where I need to be, and grateful to be surrounded by the people that I am surrounded with. So that's kind of where things stand now. I'm basically fully recovered with my ankle. No idea what the future looks like as far as career path, and I'm not even worried about it. Like, the job that I have now is fantastic. Finally in a position where, obviously, we're not rich, but we are very much taken care of and where we need to be, and that's all I can ask for. In fact, as I was writing some of these notes for this episode and going over some of the stories and some of the events in my life, I was talking to Nicole, like, I don't know how to tell this story, like my life story, and it not sound sad, because I'm getting emotional revisiting all these things, and the fear and the trauma and the struggles and the failures and my own mistakes and things outside of my control. I don't want to tell a sad story, but then when I'm writing these notes, it starts to look that way. And I'm not a sad person. I am overwhelmingly and obnoxiously joyful and optimistic, I feel like. And in typical Nicole fashion, she is wise and understanding and a great communicator. And she pointed out, that's kind of the point. The point is, all these sad things that punctuate my story, from leaving the army to a diagnosis with Crohn's, then some of the stories that came with that I didn't even share, the trauma that happened there, and leaving the army and losing friends to leaving the army, losing friends to suicide, losing friends to drug overdoses, losing family members, losing connection. It all sounds so sad, and it is. But whether you want to admit it or not, God is so good. And sometimes I hate the expression that, everything happens for a reason, so just, be happy about it. Because everything does happen for a reason. And sometimes that is divine intervention. Sometimes it is God's actual plan. But a lot of times it is people and human beings getting in the way of God's actual plan. And people do terrible things, and terrible things happen that God didn't want. But He can use anything and make something incredible out of it. And I am overwhelmingly grateful and joyful for not just the life that I have now and the incredible family that I have and the job that I have and the people that are around me, but everything that I've been through that made this situation that I'm in today. And we've talked about this, I think, in the episode about resilience, is finding the purpose in that. I'm incredibly grateful for Crohn's disease because it helped me relate to a family member when she started having a similar struggle. And on top of that, if it weren't for the Crohn's disease, maybe I would have just been lost in being a soldier and forgotten how to be a husband, and would have lost my wife, because I was a great soldier, but I wasn't a great husband. And so maybe that's what it took to pull me back and preserve my marriage. I don't know, but I'm just saying, like, there's so much good. And I could literally go on for another hour about every single bad experience or circumstance in my life and paint the picture of how good it is because of that. Nicole and I have been through so many hardships, some of them brought on by my own mistakes, some of them just, that's how life is, and those are the circumstances we found ourselves in. But if you look at the list of, the top things that result in divorce or broken households, we've been through the ringer. And the relationship that I have with my wife is something that I had been praying for, since 12 years old. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. And I know that we can get through anything because of everything that we've gone through. So I'm grateful for all of those challenges that built the foundation for our marriage and prove its value and its worth and its ability to go through those struggles. There is no questioning, if we could get through something because we've been through it. And so I hope that that's the point that I'm getting across. And, as I wrap this up for my life story, and thank you so much for sticking through to actually listen to this whole thing. The point is, it's a happy story, and I'm so grateful for every bit of it, to have the family that I have, the wife that I have in that relationship, my 3 beautiful, wonderful, exceptional daughters, and the time that I got to spend with them because of, a lot of times, the circumstances that we found ourselves in. And so maybe this is, entertaining. Maybe it's just a good story, or maybe you're somebody who's struggling with something that you don't know if you can go through it, don't know why you would go through it, don't see the purpose in it, or you feel like, I'm not going through things, so what's my value? Or, like I had mentioned before, and again in the resilience episode, talking about how my life had been so easy that I was afraid that I wouldn't be useful to other people. Don't worry. You will struggle, and it is a good thing. And so, again, thank you for listening to this. And I know that I skipped over so much, but we can't do this forever. So, if you're important in my life, I hope that you know that. And so I'm sorry if I didn't mention you. There's some of that is intentional, to respect other people, and some of it is just for the sake of being able to do this in 2 parts. I can't share every story. I'm too old for that. But thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Please feel free to reach out on any of the social media platforms that we're on. Let me know what you think of these episodes. If you have any questions, or if you have something that you would like to talk about, or if you need to reach out and connect with somebody, I always want to help. So thanks again for tuning in, guys. Take care.